Hi, I'm Matt Wheeler. I'm the digital director and co-founder of madeby.studio. I'm going to be talking to you today about the hidden impact of websites and how we as people in business or designers and developers can work together to build a greener digital world. But a bit of background about madeby.studio myself. Madeby.studio started 5 years ago with me and my co-founder as a web and applications agency. Over the past year and a half, we've really focused on building high performing, responsible websites. So we pride ourselves on our commitment to technical excellence and building solutions with sustainability and accessibility ingrained at every step of the process. So we want to minimize the environmental impact that our digital products have on the planet. And we also want to make sure that everyone has equal access to the products that we are delivering. So no matter whether you have a disability or whatever your cognitive ability may be, you should still be able to kind of navigate and use digital products the same as everyone else, because it comes under that right to access of information due to accessibility. So that's kind of like the core of what we do now. And primarily we split this across three services. So we're really underpinned by people, planet and profit. So everything we do, we care about the people we're like working with and the people that are going to be using the platforms that we are delivering. We care about the planet, so minimizing the environmental impact. But ultimately, businesses still need to make profit, so we balance that with kind of like the business case. And we do that via websites, so everything we do is sustainable websites and sustainable applications. We can do digital marketing where we can help companies articulate their green message. So some companies out there are green hushing, where they are doing a lot in sustainability, but are not talking about it. So we can help them build that narrative out. But then there's other companies that are greenwashing, where they are kind of lying about their green narratives, or they might not be articulating it in a way that is resonating. So we kind of get it in that perfect point where it's understandable, but also truthful. And the final one is digital consultancy. So we kind of audit applications, audit websites, understand the environmental impact, and then we can advise and consult on how to reduce and minimize the environmental impact of the digital products out there. So we've been trusted by kind of global organizations in the past 5 years, but over the past 1.5 years where we've had this pivot, we really focus on people that are doing social and environmental good. So companies within kind of green tech, med tech, or people that are just companies that just care about people or care about the planet. And that is kind of our bread and butter now, because it aligns with our purpose as a company and it aligns with our core values as well as the core values of our team. So just to get started and set some background about the hidden impact of websites, I've got a few stats to share to kind of set the scene, and it'll help you understand what is actually the environmental impact, because just because things are hosted in the cloud doesn't mean there is like physical entities that are hosting the whole infrastructure that we use to access like websites, social media, video streaming, and stuff like that. So if you take into account the aviation industry accounts for 2.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So this stat was taken back in 2020, so we're in 2024 now when this video is recorded, so it might be a little bit more since then. Now I want you to consider that internet use accounts for 3.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this stat was taken in 2020, so it actually highlights that the internet use is producing more greenhouse gas emissions than the aviation industry as a whole. And we are kind of constantly fed this narrative where we should fly less to kind of save the planet and stuff like that, which is very true. It does help the environment, it does help the planet. But we are never told to just kind of stop browsing as much, stop like releasing more websites, new features and stuff, because realistically the internet as a whole produces more greenhouse gas emissions than the aviation industry, but no one's actually talking about this. And so the reason why I do these talks about like sustainable websites and the environmental impact of digital infrastructure is to help people kind of understand that it does have an impact, but no one's actually kind of talking about it. So to put that in comparison to countries, if the internet was a country, it would be the fourth largest pollution in the world, which is an insane stat. And this comes from the Sustainable Web Manifesto in 2021. So again, now we're 3 years later, this stat might have been updated even more. But it kind of just puts it on scale that internet use globally is the equivalent to whole countries, which is crazy. And then when you look at the introduction of artificial intelligence, large language models, that figure is actually increasing exponentially now, because to store all that data and to process all that data, you need more physical space, which means you're building more data centers. So the rate that we're developing kind of like storage mechanisms and like having physical kind of storage items small and smaller isn't developing as fast as it is easier to build kind of data centers and physically expand them. So we are just kind of like expanding data centers over and over again. We're not considering the amount of waste that they're producing, because the more data there is, the more physical space it needs to store it. So that's just one thing to consider. So yeah, it is crazy. And one narrative I always hear from some people is that if you stick your website on green hosting, which is data centers which are running off renewable energy, it solves all the problems. That's not necessarily the case, because when you consider that when we introduced like domestic recycling, that was introduced to help the kind of waste problem we've got a problem with overconsumption of physical kind of packaging and stuff like that. Introduce recycling and hopefully it would help solve it. It is helping to a point, but we still have a major overconsumption problem. And it is the same case with websites as well. So if you're not considering the amount of data that your website or application is using, you're sticking it onto a data center, you aren't using that space efficiently, and you are encouraging the data centers to keep expanding their physical space, because you have so much waste. You could potentially like chop down the amount of data that your website uses by like a whole tenth, and then you're going to be using a tenth less of that data center. If every single website and business and application does that to their digital infrastructure, they'll be using less physical space on the data center infrastructure, using it more efficiently, and would have less wastage as a whole. So the more and more companies and businesses that understand that digital infrastructure, websites, applications actually do use physical space, and you can make it more efficient and optimize it, it will help the problem of digital waste. But again, just because we can't see it, a lot of people don't really see it as a problem, but it is there. Just because it is like kind of ones and zeros and bytes, it has to be stored on physical entities somewhere in the world. So it's time for the web to become more sustainable. So I've got kind of 10 principles that we've developed at madeby.studio. So they are kind of like surface level, where you can kind of go and do your own research if you're really interested in this topic. But the whole idea of this talk is to just introduce you to the topics, the kind of different things you can do in terms of websites, and then you can take those to your team, or if you're a designer and developer, you can actually start integrating that into your own practice as well. So we're going to start off with sustainable UI UX design. So I've got 5 principles here, which again, they just go over like that surface level, and then at the end of this talk I've got a series of resources where you can kind of go and do your own research, read through the guidelines, go through courses, and it'll help you like get a better understanding of like the deep intricacies of sustainable websites. So the first one is incorporate JEDI design practices. So this stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So for a majority of us, we are very privileged to live in a kind of like a first world country where we have very fast internet speeds. We have minimum 3G everywhere we go, and then 4G, 5G in most cities now. We usually have like the latest technology, and it gets rolled out in our countries, whether or not in kind of Central Europe, US, and those areas. Although that's not the case in every single country. For example, we have a client, Biomedica, who develop medical products for low to middle income countries, and a lot of their purchases come from sub-Saharan Africa. In those areas, they don't have the same internet speeds that we do. They run off 3G networks, they run off tech probably 5 years behind us, because they don't have the latest kind of iPhones and stuff like that, because people can't afford them. So in these hospitals, which are very low in funding, they still need to be able to access the websites and the applications we're delivering to make sure they can still make a purchase or request a quote for a new product. So we've really got to consider, what is the user base of the websites? Are we making it accessible to every single person out there? If we just considered, for example, the UK where we're based, sure, everyone in the UK will be able to access the website pretty much everywhere. But when you try to access that website in one of these like sub-Saharan African countries, they wouldn't be able to load it up. It might take too long because the internet speeds couldn't handle it. It might take 10-20 seconds to load, and by that time someone's probably thought the website's broken, so never even made it to it. So you've got to consider like those aspects, which a lot of people don't do. So design is for everyone. You've got to minimize the amount of assets, the amount of like kind of heavy assets, which I'll go into later, to make sure that you aren't creating wasted data. You aren't just kind of adding to the size of the website for the sake of it. Everything that you are designing into that website is very mindful. It's very intentional as well, because you don't want to just put something just because it looks nice. It needs to have a reason. It's got to kind of build the narrative and help the flow of that website. Number 2 is plan the journey. So a short or more concise user journey not only provides an increased ROI, so return on investment, but also saves on energy. And quite often I hear people request websites, but they just want all their information, like absolutely everything about their company, just shoved in as far as possible. They have like these sections with massive paragraphs, and each paragraph might have like 10 sentences. When someone's visiting a website, they don't expect to read the page of a book. They just want to kind of like read what they need to know. So the less is more, essentially, in websites. Like if it's very concise and you are conveying the information you need to convey very efficiently, people are more likely to stay in that journey of the website. So make sure that there is a lot of clarity of that content. Use white space where you can. Don't just kind of connect sections up for the sake of it. Again, I always hear people say like, you can only see one section at a time on the screen. I want to see like 3. People on websites that are navigating websites, they have a very short attention span. If you put these 3 sections squished in, they don't know where to look, so they just leave the website or they navigate somewhere else because they've kind of like got into a point of their journey where they're struggling to know what they should be focusing on. But by using effective white space and splitting it out, they know that, okay, this bit is part of their screen real estate right now, so they should focus on that and then scroll to the next area. And then use primary call to action. So you can see on this website that we designed on the left, we've got the kind of get started with cloud today. So there's a massive call to action. So once someone's gone through this whole kind of journey, they've understood the tools that are going on, and they've seen like the stats, they know that their next step is that big call to action. It takes them to the next part of their journey. And also we have no potential distractors on there as well. If you have loads and loads and loads of different call to actions all doing different things, which one has most priority? It is best to have 1, at most 2 call to actions. So maybe one is kind of find out more info, which is a secondary call to action, but the primary is book a call now, or next step. So we've got in this version here. So it just makes sure that the user is being guided down a path. There's no confusion. They know exactly where they're going. And if that user can get from A to B in less steps, that's less load time for the website, it's less data requested from the server, and ultimately that saves on energy because you've got less requests to load each page out. And then also accessibility is one that I'll mention over and over again in this talk, but accessibility should be ingrained in everything we do. Everyone has the same right to access for information, so you've just got to make sure that it is in the whole design process, it's in the whole development process as well. And again, just to repeat kind of less is more, keep it lightweight. So again, like you don't need to overload your website with images, you don't need to overload it with videos, because quite often it actually slows down the website loading speed. It has a negative effect on sustainability. You're just adding additional data to load for the sake of it. So everything that you have on that website should be very, very concise. It should be there in intention. So you can see here on this Choose Your Charger application we built, we just have 2 choices. So this is kind of a quote flow to understand what electric vehicle charger that user may need. So rather than adding images and pictures and loads of text, we've just had one simple question. It's like, do you have private or street parking? Private or street are the two answers. It's a very simple journey, there's no distractions, but it's probably one of the most effective journeys you can have because people know exactly what the next step is to do. So they go through this process really, really efficiently. And also because every single page is so lightweight, there is barely any data to load. So it actually has a really positive effect on the sustainability of the website. And also it's like a massive performance increase as well. So a lot of sustainability practices in design and development for websites has a massive positive effect for performance. So it's kind of a no-brainer to integrate sustainability because if you look at like search engine optimization, being sustainable actually has a positive effect on the search engine optimization as well. And then number 4 is reduce, optimize, and remove the heavy assets. So if you have a video on your website, be very careful of how you use that video. So based on like a lot of the sustainability audits I've been doing recently, videos account for pretty much 90% of the load time on a website. They tend to be huge in terms of data size, and to load those in from a server requires a lot of energy and it's incredibly unsustainable. So if you have a video, let's say in the hero section, and it's got like that classic kind of car tail lights which have got like the kind of delay on the lighting, which isn't actually providing any value, do you really need it? It might look cool, but it's actually probably doing more harm than good because it's a potential distraction. So you could potentially just remove that completely, use like nothing at all, or at most just use a very optimized image instead, because then you are not kind of guiding the user's eyes away from the content, you're not kind of just adding unnecessary data. But let's say you do need a video in, as it does convey a lot of information, so let's say it's kind of an infographic led video which does kind of outline how you run as a company, and it is essential there, and it would require kind of pages and pages of content. A video might make sense. The best way to host it on your website is upload it directly to your server, because then you can optimize it for your website. You only just load in that video when it's needed. Make sure to turn autoplay off, because again, if someone doesn't want to watch the video and it just starts playing, it requires energy to load that in. And also having autoplay on is probably one of the most annoying things that you can have on a website. If you just get some random sound and music playing, you don't know where it's coming from, you tend to just leave the website anyway, so that's just something to consider. And then if you wanted to host it on YouTube or Vimeo, I usually recommend to avoid that, because if you host it on a third-party platform and then embed it, when someone visits the website and clicks play from a YouTube embed, YouTube brings in loads and loads and loads of different tracking scripts. Again, that wastes loads of energy, and also for kind of GDPR and accessibility, it's more stuff to handle in terms of like the legal area. So the most efficient way is to just upload it directly to the video, make sure it's optimized pre-uploading, and turn autoplay off. So yeah. And then number 5 in terms of design is use a concise design system. So this is one that I'm very passionate about. So for example, you wouldn't have a choir singing off different hymn sheets. It would sound awful. It's the same case when you're designing websites. Designers should be working off the same hymn sheet. So this is where design systems come through. So in a design system, you can kind of set the boundaries of your font choices, your colors, your typographic choices. And that's kind of a way to guide designers to make sure that they all are following the same set of rules and principles. If, let's say, you are building a design system and you want to have fonts in there, I always recommend maximum 2 fonts of 2 different weights per font, because you don't need to shove loads in. I've seen websites where they have 10 different fonts and they have 9 different weights per font, and essentially that adds up to 90 different fonts that you have to load into the website at some point, which is incredibly inefficient, and also has massive negative performance effects as well. So that's just one thing to consider. And also, when you come to design the blocks, make sure that you are using kind of what's called a atomic design process. So when you have components on a website and you're designing them out, what you would usually see is you might have 5 of the same component and people will just design it 5 times and copy and paste it through. But the thing is, if a client comes along in the future and just says, I want to update this particular section, you'll have to go into every single component you've copied and pasted and update it. If you are using a design system effectively, so you can do this in Figma, which is design software, you can set kind of a master template. So let's say you've got a block with image on the left, text on the right. You set that as the master, and then you can have dependencies come off that. So you have this one block, and you just import that block to different areas of like the artboards you've got. So if you updated that master block, it would update all the other instances of that across the board. So again, it makes sure that it's really, really consistent. If another designer comes into your team, they know exactly what to work off, because they can also import their instance of that block as well. And also it reduces the repetition for work, and it makes it incredibly sustainable and also scalable. So you really want to kind of get the longevity of your website as far as possible. Quite often I see companies replace their websites every 3 years because they get a lot of technical debt, they don't have a system in place. So as they add more features and blocks, it gets harder and harder to keep up to date, and eventually gets to a point where it's actually just more cost effective to start from scratch. If you have a design system in place and it's managed very well, when someone adds new features or they expand the website out, it's all just pulling from these kind of like central source of truth blocks. So you have all like the dependencies, you add a new feature, you just bring in another dependency, build out your page like it's Lego, and it makes it incredibly efficient. So you can actually kind of get the longevity of your website to hit like 5, 6, 7 years if you wanted to. And also, if you wanted to do a complete refresh, you would just have to kind of update those particular blocks, and it will kind of spread it across the whole artboard. So it's just essentially a way of standardizing how you build websites. So the bigger the website, bigger the organization, the more of a positive effect this will have. So that's everything in terms of sustainable design. The next 5 points are sustainable development. So I've not gone too technical into some of these areas. I've just kept it surface level, but again, the resources at the end of this talk will just kind of highlight the intricacies, and like if you wanted to find a bit more about kind of particular topics, you can look at those resources. So number 1 in terms of sustainable development is use green web hosting. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but it does solve part of the problem. So there are some data centers which I've mentioned here. So one of the best resources if you want to find out if your website is running on renewable energy is the Green Web Foundation. So you can enter your website address and it'll tell you if the IP address of your server is sustainable. So it's a really quick way to find out, but I've got a link to that at the end of this talk. Then the next is DigitalOcean London 1, which they run off a data center called Equinix, which is fully renewable energy hosted, and then there's like Scaleway, Crystal Hosting. So there's quite a few from there, but if you look at the Green Web Directory, they have a full list of all the global data centers which run off renewable energy, because it's better to be sustainable. If you are making a choice for your data center, you don't really want to be hosting off a fossil fuel data center. The next is repeat and reuse. So this ties very closely into the design system. So let's say your designers have finished the website design, they've fully completed that design system, and it gets handed over to a developer. A developer also wants to build in that kind of modular way as well. So when they are coding blocks, rather than coding the same block 5 different times, they could potentially code it once. So you can see on the left here, we've got kind of a drop-down menu. Let's say we had a drop-down menu that appeared 5 times on our website. All we'd have to do is write import drop-down menu, change the content using variable kind of names and stuff, and then that will just import it into different areas. And then let's say a year down the line we wanted to update the look and feel of it, or we had a client have a request for a change across all these 5 blocks, all we'd have to do is go into that one kind of component, update what we need to update, and it will just share it to all of the kind of dependencies across the whole application or website. So the modular way of building is the best way in terms of websites. It makes it really efficient, it reduces the amount of code kind of repetition, it reduces the amount of work it takes to build particular blocks, so you're saving energy there, and also it makes it incredibly scalable. So as we mentioned before in design, if you have a modular development system as well, it makes it very easy to add new features. It makes it very easy to kind of tweak kind of particular blocks and stuff. And that's just through reducing the technical debt as a whole. It also provides a lot of consistency in the whole website. So again, when we look at the kind of user journey, if everything is consistent in terms of development, that will tie into the consistency of design, so they come hand in hand. Design and development are usually kind of identified as like different departments, but realistically, when a designer is designing, a developer should be in that process, kind of like supporting them, saying like, oh, we could actually do this in terms of development to help your design and the flow. And then when a developer is developing, the designer should be there chipping in, saying, actually, I know I want it like this, we could do this to benefit the user journey, so they should be working in tandem. And then everything should align with the best practice. So this is pretty standard for developers. It's quite impressive that a lot of developers don't actually follow best practice. They might have done like kind of a React course, but they've never actually learned what is the true best practice they should be following. So that's something to consider. So if you're a developer building a website, make sure you are keeping up to date with the latest updates with frameworks, languages, and make sure that you're using the newest and latest technologies out there. And then the final one is code splitting. So this again ties into the partials and the modular-led development. So when you have a website, and let's say we don't build it in a modular way, all that code for the whole website will appear on every single page in terms of like the JavaScript and the style sheets and stuff, which is what allows for the interactivity and that kind of look and feel of the website. That's really inefficient, because if you're loading code that you don't even need on some pages, it's just wasted energy. It takes a long time to load. It has negative effects on the performance. So by using code splitting, which is essentially splitting the code out to only requiring what you need exactly per page, makes it really efficient. So let's say we only needed this drop-down menu styles on this page that we're loading out. It would just bring in the JavaScript and the CSS for that one tiny component, and everything else within a whole application would be left aside, so it would never load into that page. But let's say we wanted to bring in like a pop-up menu, we could import that, and then we would just have drop-down menu and pop-up menu, and everything else would be left behind. So it makes it really efficient, so you're only loading in what's absolutely necessary to make each page work. So that's just something to kind of look into in more detail if you're interested in that as well. Then number 8 is reduce the page weight. So the whole part of sustainable development is you want to minimize the amount of data as a whole that your website takes to load. So minify your code. So if you don't know what minifying is, that is essentially kind of compressing your code to be as short as you can, because each character takes up data. So there are methods such as kind of like compilation techniques, which will just minify this for you, and it just compresses all the values you've got into like this squish code. You won't be able to read it as like a human because it's so kind of scrambled, but it reduces the data size massively. As I mentioned before, restrict the font weight. So maximum 2 fonts usually, you can push to 3, but make sure you are only loading in the font weights that you need on your website. So if you're importing from like Google Fonts, don't import all 9 weights when you're only using one. Just import that one weight that you need, because it's just a waste of energy to load in all those other ones that you're not actually using. So that's one thing to consider. Another method is inlining your scripts and styles. So if you have the opportunity, and let's say we had like an interactive block on a website, rather than loading like the JavaScript from a separate file, you could potentially just inline that within the actual page itself. So that requires one less file to load, and it'll just be embedded directly in like the HTML to load the website up. So that's just another thing to consider. Static site generation, where you have like the biggest impact you can on a website. So when a user requests your website, rather than talking to the server to compile the website for them and then send it all back, what you can do is the server can generate static caches, which is essentially just a single file of everything that that user will need to load in the website. So rather than user going all the way to the server has to compile all the files, then send it back. The user can just kind of go to the front of the server, ask for that static generated file, which is pre-cached, and it'll just send it straight back. It tends to be like, in some cases, 10 times faster, and also those files have already been kind of pre-compressed. So the amount of data and the amount of energy it takes to render those pages is way less than having the server to kind of do the whole process to render it out. Another one is optimize images and videos. So if you have to use videos, make sure they are heavily optimized to the point that you can get them as small as possible while retaining the quality. And again, if you're using images, minimize the amount of images and only use them if they're absolutely necessary to convey particular information, or add to kind of like the user flow. What we always aim for is we aim to have images below 250 kilobytes maximum across the whole website, no matter where they are. The smaller the better, while retaining that quality as well is the best way, because you can like push the compression of images quite far without actually losing any of the quality behind them. Then lazy load all your visual assets. So in coding, you can actually just on images write this tag which is lazy load equals true, and essentially what that will do is anything below the fold of a website, so let's say you have the initial kind of load, anything below where you have to scroll to is below the fold. Having lazy load equals true on the items below there, such as images, means they won't load in until they kind of approach the fold. So let's say someone just navigates to the hero of your website but never actually scrolls, they're not loading in all the other images across the whole page. But if you didn't have lazy load on that first request, every single image would load throughout the whole page, even to the ones they've never scrolled to. So that's just something to consider. Then use modern image and video formats. So we use a CDN system called IMGIX to do this, which delivers the most modern image and video format for us. So it does the compression for us, it resizes the images based on the user's browser and device, and it also delivers images that are quite tricky to use, such as kind of AVIF and WebP. So it understands what's supported by that user's browser, what's supported by that user's device, and it will just deliver the correct image for us. Again, that has massive performance and sustainability benefits, because using these very modern image compression formats can reduce the image file sizes by even more than half in some cases. Then remove unnecessary code bloat. Is that code really needed? If it's just sitting there doing nothing, just delete it. Or if it's a very inefficient process which isn't really adding value, delete it. You don't want just waste sitting around, do you? So you need to make sure that your code is kept very clean. 9, so cache. This is the one that will have the biggest impact. So this ties into static caching. So make sure that your whole website is statically generated, which is essentially just compiling the website down to kind of HTML files, makes it really efficient to load, uses less data, uses less energy. But also you can cache particular assets on your website as well. So if you are managing servers, you can add different compression techniques onto your server, such as like Brotli compression, gzip compression, and that would allow you to cache images, fonts, anything you want. So you can just kind of choose by the file type, and you can set how long they'll be cached for, so such as 30 days on the server, or if it's never going to be changed, just basically never reset that cache of an image. So that's just one way to do it. Increases performance and reduces the page weight as a whole. Then 10 is that content really needed? So this really just ties into kind of the wastage of websites. Like 90.6% of internet gets absolutely no traffic from Google, which is crazy. So we have so much content out there sitting on data centers, not doing anything at all. No one's ever accessing it. So why do we need it? Just because no one accesses it doesn't mean it doesn't require require energy from data centers to keep hosting it. So rather than having a blog with hundreds of blog posts with kind of new employee announcements from 10 years ago, just wipe it out. Because not only that will save energy, save data, but it will actually enhance the performance of your website, especially in SEO. Google rewards websites with relevant and quality content. If you've got content from 10 years ago that's not very relevant now, it's not going to reward it. So that's just one thing to consider. Being sustainable doesn't mean sacrificing the results, though. So being sustainable actually supports the results in many cases, which I'm going to go through like a case study here just to show you. So if we take into account that a typical website generates 0.235 grams of CO2 estimated per view, With 10,000 monthly views, this will amount to 29 kilograms of CO2 annually, which is comparable to 3,820 hours used for LED light bulb, 1,364 kettles boiled, or 167 hours used for mobile phone. Then on the carbon rating scale, which is like a standardized scale of measuring the sustainability of websites, that will be rated as C, so pretty average. So, for example, we built a sustainable website for one of our clients, Vico, who is in the prop tech industry. And I've got an example of what it looks like here. So you can see here that it's very interactive. We've got dynamic elements. It's very lightweight, and we still have quite a few images to kind of display their software, because that's a key part of their service offering. You can see here we've got nice kind of animations, transitions, and you can see stuff loads in. And you wouldn't think this is a sustainable website. The common misconception is that if you have a sustainable website, it's going to be really kind of minimal. It's going to be kind of, you're going to be sacrificing so much interactivity, so much design, but that's not actually the case. Because you can see here that we've made it feel very dynamic, and it's incredibly fast when we load through pages. So you can see here that the loading is literally in the milliseconds. Some websites will take a second to load in some cases, but we can flick through everything incredibly fast. And that just enhances that user experience. It makes sure people can get through page by page really fast and efficiently to find exactly what they're looking for. But if we take into account kind of that user experience and design that we've built, when we carried out an audit of Vico after we delivered it, this website per page load generates 0.09 grams of CO2 estimated per view. That's accounts to 1,453 hours of an LED bulb, 519 kettles boiled, and 152 hours of mobile phone usage. So on the carbon rating scale, that's an A, and we also use green hosting because our whole infrastructure runs off renewable energy. So you can see the differences in the stats here, that it is essentially less than half of what the average is, but it's also very dynamic. It's still very interactive, and it enhances that user flow. Then in terms of like lighthouse audits, so if we're looking at like the performance, best practices, accessibility, SEO, we get 97 performance and then 100 across the other three. It can be tricky to get 100 on performance, but I think 97 is close enough in this case. But you can see that being sustainable actually enhances the overall results which Google uses to index websites and understand whether a website is built well. So that's just another thing to consider. So if you're kind of questioning why is sustainability important for websites and applications, this is why, because it all goes hand in hand. And then for Vico, since the launch, we had a 265% increase in website engagement time within the first 3 months of launch. So for them, we built kind of like conversion flows and qualification processes. And due to the performance increases from the sustainable practices that we integrated, they had some massive increases in engagement time. They've got a lot more leads coming through. And there's a few other clients where we've built sustainable websites where they've seen massive increases in terms of kind of like the product quotation requests, service requests, and in one case we actually had a 52% increase in product inquiries. So nearly half, basically kind of half their doubled. They had double the amount of inquiries from 3 months post-launch, to the point where they couldn't actually handle the amount of inquiries that come through, because essentially it's due to how efficient the website was. So it's allowing users to kind of get through that flow, go through the processes, and make requests for product quotations really efficiently. So again, that's just another example of how building efficient websites can actually support the business case as well. So there is no trade-off by being sustainable. It all comes hand in hand, like I mentioned before. But ultimately, it is all about reducing the wastage. You know, if you look at physical products, especially recycling, when we have an overconsumption an overconsumption problem, we are producing more waste than we can handle. It's the same case with websites. If we are producing websites with loads and loads of data, there is a lot of wastage involved in that. So if we all started working together, and as designers, developers, business owners really considered how can we reduce the amount of data that our websites use, make them really efficient and make everything really intentional. That reduces the amount of wastage that we are adding onto data centers. We can use data centers more efficiently, we can add more websites and applications onto these data centers, and as a whole that should decrease the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the web as a whole creates globally. So ultimately it is all just about reducing wastage. If you see data as a physical entity rather than just kind of like this thing in the cloud, then it helps it make sense. But it's really difficult to start being sustainable in terms of IT and infrastructure and websites unless you know where to start. So this is why I built my own tool, which helps us understand the emissions of websites. So if you go to audit.madeby.studio and drop your details in here with your website, I can carry out an audit on your website and it'll allow you to benchmark where you're currently at. And also we can do a comparison against your competitors. So let's say you wanted to make sure that your website is more sustainable than one of your competitors, I can drop theirs in and it'll do kind of a full benchmarking process of the amount of emissions, but also a breakdown of performance, accessibility, SEO and best practice. So you can visit that at audit.madeby.studio. And just to finish off, I've got a few helpful resources that I can share where they go from kind of like the surface level to more like the software engineering side. So whether you're just kind of interested as a business owner or whether you're a designer or a developer, there will be a resource for you. So the first one is the Web Sustainability Guidelines 1.0. This is still in draft, but it's being developed by the guys or the company that develops the accessibility guidelines. So it's going to be a set of guidelines of how to build websites in a very sustainable manner. So it goes into very like intricate levels of particular components, particular items. So how can you build like images in a sustainable way? How can you build particular blocks in a sustainable way? I'm not sure the official release date of this, but once it's fully released, it's going to be an incredible resource of how you can get like the granular level sustainable improvements across websites. The next one is sustainable web design. So sustainable web design is the people that develop the carbon rating scale, and they've got a full algorithm of how you can kind of calculate the sustainability of a website using the data center, the wire and the client side energy usage. They also have a set of really interesting guidelines and articles which can advise you in the best ways to like be more sustainable in terms of design and development. So really interesting there. Then the Green Web Foundation, which I mentioned at the start of this talk, is a resource where you can drop your website in and it'll tell you whether your website is running on renewable energy. They also have a huge directory of all the global data centers that run off green and renewable energy. So that's worth looking into. So if your website isn't running on renewable energy and it flags up as red, you can just look through that directory, chat to your developer or your hosting company, just say, I want to switch to this data center because they are renewable, and they should be able to make that switch very easily. So everyone should realistically be hosting on data centers which run off renewable energy nowadays. It's very simple to do. Then the final one, which is more looking into like the software side of things, is the Green Software Foundation, which is backed by the Linux Foundation. So it goes into a lot of like the practices, the toolings and the standards of how to develop software in a very sustainable way. They also have what's called the Green Software Practitioner course, where it teaches you the core theory and principles of building software in a sustainable way, how you can measure it, and also how the grid works and how you can leverage the grid and when renewable energy is most active to be more sustainable in terms of your software. So that's really interesting. So if you wanted a more like kind of like technical, granular level in terms of software, the Green Software Foundation is the place to look. That is my whole talk. I've got it in 45 minutes, which is great. You can connect with me on LinkedIn via Matt Multiplied or scan this QR code here. Again, if you wanted me to audit your website for sustainability, performance, SEO, best practice and accessibility, visit audit.madeby.studio and drop your link in there. Any questions, feel free to reach out to me on my email, which I've got on the screen here, or you can just drop me a message on LinkedIn. Thank you for coming to my talk.